In the scorching heat of a Roman summer afternoon in 18 BC, a woman named Livia Marcella stood trembling before the Forum Romanum as hundreds of citizens gathered to witness what would become one of the most brutal spectacles in the empire's history. She was 26 years old, the wife of a prominent senator, educated in Greek philosophy and Roman law, accused of something that would seal her fate in ways more horrific than death itself. The charge against her was adultery, and in the Roman Empire, this accusation carried consequences so devastating that they would reshape not just her life, but the very foundations of how an entire civilization viewed women, marriage, and justice. But before I reveal what happened to Livia in that sun-baked forum, before I describe the unthinkable torments that awaited unfaithful wives in ancient Rome, you need to understand something crucial. What I'm about to tell you isn't folklore or legend. These aren't stories embellished over centuries of retelling. Every punishment, every ritual of humiliation, every method of destruction I'll describe comes directly from Roman legal codes, from the writings of historians like Tacitus and Suetonius, from court records preserved in stone and papyrus, from the laws themselves carved into marble and bronze that still exist today. This is documented history, recorded by the very people who carried out these punishments, justified by the legal system that created them. The Roman approach to punishing adulteresses wasn't just about justice. It was about sending a message that would echo through generations, about maintaining a social order built on absolute male authority, about transforming individual women into walking warnings for every other wife in the empire. If you want to understand how entire civilizations can normalize systematic violence, how accusations become weapons more deadly than gladiator swords, how gender-based terror can be woven into the fabric of law and custom until it becomes invisible to those who practice it, then you need to hear these stories. Subscribe to this channel right now, because we're about to journey into one of the darkest chapters in human history, where the line between justice and sadism disappeared entirely, where the price of being accused was often worse than the crime itself. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because this story needs to be told, these women need to be remembered, and you need to understand how quickly civilization can become barbarism when power goes unchecked. The story begins not with Livia, but with understanding how Roman society created the perfect conditions for these horrors to flourish. In ancient Rome, marriage wasn't about love or companionship or personal fulfillment. It was a political and economic contract between families, a way to consolidate wealth, forge alliances, and produce legitimate heirs who could inherit property and carry on family names. Women in Roman society existed primarily as vessels for this system, their value measured entirely by their ability to produce children and maintain the honor of their husband's household. Roman law was absolutely clear about a woman's place in society. Under the concept of patria potestas, women never achieved full legal independence. They passed from the authority of their fathers directly to the authority of their husbands, remaining perpetual minors in the eyes of the law, regardless of their age, intelligence, or accomplishments. A Roman woman could not own property in her own name, could not enter into contracts, could not represent herself in court, could not make decisions about her own children, and certainly could not choose her own husband or decide to divorce him if she became unhappy. But it was the Roman obsession with honor that created the truly dangerous conditions for women. Roman men derived their social standing, their political power, and their very identity from their reputation for virtue and strength. A man's honor depended on his ability to control his household, to ensure the absolute fidelity of his wife, and to demonstrate to the community that he was master of his own domain. A wife's adultery didn't just damage the husband personally, it attacked the fundamental basis of his social existence, marking him as weak, ineffective, unable to manage even his own home. This obsession with male honor created a system where accusations of adultery became weapons that could destroy women instantly and completely. A husband who suspected his wife of infidelity faced enormous pressure to act decisively and publicly. To ignore potential adultery was to invite mockery and social destruction. To handle it quietly or privately was seen as weakness. The only acceptable response was public, dramatic, and severe enough to restore the husband's reputation while serving as a warning to every other woman in Rome. The legal framework that governed adultery in Rome was codified in the Lex Julia de Adulteriis, passed by Emperor Augustus in 18 BC as part of his broader moral reforms. This law didn't just make adultery illegal, it created an entire apparatus of punishment designed to destroy adulterous women while protecting and empowering their husbands. Under this law, a husband who discovered his wife in adultery had the legal right to kill both her and her lover on the spot, provided he could prove he had caught them in the act. If he chose not to exercise this right immediately, he was required to divorce his wife and bring formal charges against her in court. The penalties established by the Lex Julia were carefully designed to destroy the convicted woman completely. She would lose half of her dowry and 1/3 of her property to her husband. She would be forbidden from remarrying, effectively ending any possibility of restoring her social position or economic security. She would be exiled to a remote island, cut off from family, friends, and everything familiar. And she would be forced to wear the toga, the garment of prostitutes, marking her permanently as a fallen woman whose very presence corrupted virtuous society. But the formal legal penalties were just the beginning. Roman society had developed elaborate customs and rituals around the punishment of adulteresses, traditions that went far beyond what the law required and that were designed to maximize both the woman's suffering and the community's participation in her destruction. These informal punishments were often more brutal than the legal ones, and they reveal the depth of Roman society's commitment to controlling women through terror. The process typically began with the accusation itself, which in Roman society was a public act that immediately destroyed the woman's reputation, whether or not the charges were ever proven. Unlike modern legal systems, Roman law placed the burden of proof on the accused woman to demonstrate her innocence, rather than requiring the accuser to prove guilt. This meant that once an accusation was made, the woman was presumed guilty until she could somehow prove otherwise, a nearly impossible task in a society where women's testimony carried little weight and where the standards of evidence were heavily biased against them. Roman courts hearing adultery cases operated under principles that made defense almost impossible for accused women. The testimony of slaves could be admitted as evidence, but only after the slaves had been tortured, based on the Roman belief that slaves would only tell the truth under extreme physical duress. The woman's own testimony about her behavior and whereabouts was considered inherently unreliable, because Roman legal theory held that women were naturally deceptive and prone to lying to protect themselves. Male testimony, particularly from the husband making the accusation, carried far more weight than anything the woman herself might say. The social dynamics surrounding adultery accusations created additional pressures that made defense nearly impossible. Other women were reluctant to testify on behalf of an accused adulteress because doing so might suggest they approved of adultery or that they themselves were morally suspect. Men had strong incentives to support the accusing husband because challenging his accusations might imply they questioned his honor or his authority over his household. The entire community had reasons to see the woman punished, because her punishment reinforced the social order that everyone depended on for stability and predictability. Let me tell you about Claudia Pulkra, whose story illustrates how easily the machinery of accusation and punishment could be set in motion, and how impossible it was to stop once it began. Claudia was the wife of Marcus Valerius Messala, a wealthy merchant who had made his fortune importing goods from Egypt and the eastern provinces. She was 32 years old in the year 23 AD, had been married for 14 years, and had borne 3 children who had survived to adulthood. By Roman standards, she was a model wife, who had fulfilled her primary obligations to her husband and to society. Claudia's destruction began with something as innocent as attending a dinner party at the home of a family friend. The party was hosted by Gaius Asinius Pollio, a respected senator whose wife had been Claudia's close friend since childhood. Among the guests was a young poet named Ovid Naso, a rising talent in Roman literary circles who was known for his wit and charm. During the evening, Claudia and Ovid engaged in conversation about poetry and philosophy, topics that educated Roman women of the upper classes were expected to be knowledgeable about. The conversation was completely public, taking place in the main dining room in front of dozens of other guests. Claudia and Ovid discussed the works of Homer and Virgil, debated questions of literary style and meaning, and shared observations about the cultural life of Rome. Other guests participated in the conversation at various points, and there was nothing secretive or inappropriate about their interaction. Claudia laughed at some of Ovid's more clever observations, asked thoughtful questions about his work, and displayed the kind of intelligence and cultural sophistication that was considered admirable in women of her class. But Roman society was intensely suspicious of any interaction between married women and men who were not their husbands, even in completely public settings. Several guests at the party noted that Claudia seemed to enjoy Ovid's conversation, that she laughed at his jokes, that she asked questions that suggested genuine interest in his ideas. These observations were perfectly accurate, but in the paranoid atmosphere of Roman social life, they were also potentially dangerous. Enjoying a man's conversation too much could be interpreted as showing interest in the man himself. Laughing too readily at his jokes could suggest flirtation. Asking too many questions could imply a desire for continued contact. Within days of the dinner party, gossip about Claudia's behavior had spread throughout the social circles of upper-class Rome. The gossip was initially mild, focusing on her apparent fascination with the young poet, her animated conversation with him, the way she had seemed to hang on his words. But gossip has a way of growing as it spreads, and each retelling added new details, new interpretations, new suggestions of impropriety. By the time the stories reached Marcus, Claudia's husband, they had been transformed into something far more serious than the reality of a public conversation at a dinner party. Marcus heard that his wife had been seen behaving inappropriately with a young poet, that she had shown obvious interest in another man, that people were talking about her conduct, that whispers and knowing looks followed him wherever he went in Roman society. His honor as a husband was being questioned, his reputation as a man who could control his household was being damaged, and his social and political position was being undermined by his wife's supposed misconduct. Marcus confronted Claudia in their private chambers 3 days after the dinner party, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. He had spent those days listening to whispered conversations that stopped when he entered rooms, enduring the pitying looks of other senators, feeling his political alliances weaken as rumors spread about his inability to control his own wife. When he finally spoke to Claudia, his words were cold and calculated, designed not to discover truth, but to justify the action he had already decided to take. Claudia tried desperately to explain what had actually happened at the dinner party. She described the public nature of her conversation with Ovid, the presence of dozens of witnesses, the complete propriety of their interaction. She reminded Marcus that she had been accompanied by her personal slave throughout the evening, that she had never been alone with the poet, that their conversation had covered only literary and philosophical topics appropriate for educated discourse. She begged her husband to speak with other guests who had been present, who could confirm that nothing improper had occurred. But Marcus was not interested in her explanations or her evidence. In his mind, the damage was already done. Whether or not Claudia had actually committed adultery was less important than the fact that people believed she might have. His honor had been compromised, his reputation damaged, his position in society undermined. The only way to restore his standing was to act decisively against his wife. to demonstrate that he was strong enough to punish betrayal and wise enough to recognize it when it occurred. Under Roman law, Marcus had several options available to him. He could kill Claudia immediately if he claimed to have caught her in the act of adultery, though this would require witnesses and evidence he did not possess. He could divorce her quietly and send her back to her father's household, but this would suggest weakness and might imply that her misconduct was not serious enough to warrant severe punishment. Or he could make a public accusation of adultery, bringing formal charges that would result in a trial, public humiliation, and if she were convicted, the complete destruction of her life. Marcus chose the most public and devastating option available to him. He announced throughout Roman society that he was formally accusing his wife of adultery with the poet Ovid Naso, that he would be bringing charges against her in the courts, and that he expected all right-thinking citizens to support his quest for justice. The announcement was not just a legal proceeding, but a political statement, a demonstration of his commitment to traditional Roman values and his determination to protect the sanctity of marriage. The formal accusation triggered an immediate and devastating response from Roman society. Claudia was instantly ostracized by every social circle she had ever been part of. Women who had been her friends for decades refused to receive her in their homes, afraid that association with an accused adulteress would contaminate their own reputations. Men avoided her completely, unwilling to risk being seen as sympathetic to a woman who had allegedly betrayed her husband. Even slaves and servants began treating her differently, sensing the shift in her status and adjusting their behavior accordingly. The trial of Claudia Pulkra became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in Rome that year, not because of any particular legal complexity, but because it offered the public an opportunity to witness the destruction of a prominent woman while reinforcing their own commitment to traditional values. The courtroom was packed with spectators who had come not to see justice done, but to enjoy the spectacle of a fallen woman receiving her punishment. The prosecution's case against Claudia was built entirely on interpretation and innuendo, rather than evidence of actual wrongdoing. Witnesses testified that they had seen her talking animatedly with Ovid at the dinner party, that she had laughed at his remarks, that she had asked questions about his work, that she had seemed interested in his conversation. These facts were presented not as evidence of normal social interaction, but as proof of inappropriate fascination with another man. The prosecution argued that a truly virtuous wife would have maintained proper reserve, would have shown minimal interest in any man other than her husband, would have demonstrated through her behavior that she was focused entirely on her domestic duties rather than on intellectual pursuits that might lead her astray. Expert witnesses testified about the proper behavior expected of Roman wives, explaining to the court that excessive interest in poetry and philosophy could be dangerous for women because it encouraged them to think independently and to value intellectual stimulation over domestic submission. They argued that women who engaged too enthusiastically in literary discussion were more likely to be seduced by clever words and philosophical arguments, making them vulnerable to the advances of educated men who might exploit their intellectual curiosity for immoral purposes. The defense that Claudia's advocates attempted to mount was hampered by the legal and social constraints that governed Roman trials. They could not call Claudia herself to testify because Roman law considered women's testimony in their own defense to be inherently unreliable. They struggled to find witnesses willing to testify on her behalf because doing so might suggest they approved of her alleged misconduct. The few people who did agree to speak for her were forced to limit their testimony to general statements about her character, rather than specific evidence about what had actually happened at the dinner party. Even more damaging was the testimony of Ovid himself, who was brought before the court and interrogated about his interaction with Claudia. Under intense pressure and facing potential charges as her accomplice, Ovid testified that while nothing improper had occurred between them, he had found Claudia to be an unusually intelligent and engaging conversationalist. He admitted that he had enjoyed talking with her, that he had been impressed by her knowledge of literature, that their conversation had been more stimulating than he typically experienced with Roman women. This testimony, intended to support Claudia's innocence, was instead interpreted by the court as confirmation of her guilt. The prosecution argued that if Ovid had found Claudia particularly engaging and stimulating, this proved that she had been trying to impress him, that she had been displaying herself inappropriately, that she had been using her education and intelligence not for proper domestic purposes, but to attract the attention of another man. The very qualities that should have made her admirable as an educated Roman woman were twisted into evidence of her moral corruption. The trial lasted for 3 days, with each day bringing new testimony designed to destroy not just Claudia's reputation, but her entire sense of self. Witnesses described her behavior at other social gatherings, looking for patterns that might suggest a history of inappropriate conduct. Her education was presented as evidence of dangerous independence rather than admirable accomplishment. Her intelligence was characterized as cunning, designed to deceive her husband rather than a gift to be celebrated. On the final day of the trial, the verdict was announced to a courtroom packed with spectators who had come to witness the conclusion of this public drama. Claudia was found guilty of adultery based on her inappropriate behavior with Ovid Naso, her excessive interest in literary matters, and her failure to maintain the proper reserve expected of a Roman wife. The judge, reading from a prepared statement, declared that while the evidence might not prove actual physical adultery, it clearly demonstrated a corruption of spirit and a violation of wifely duty that was just as damaging to the institution of marriage. The sentence pronounced against Claudia included all the standard penalties established by Roman law for convicted adulteresses, but it also included additional humiliations that reflected the court's particular disdain for her case. She would forfeit half of her dowry and 1/3 of her property to her former husband. She would be forbidden from remarrying, ensuring that she could never restore her social position or economic security. She would be exiled to a barren island in the Mediterranean, cut off from family and friends and everything familiar. But before the exile could begin, Claudia would undergo a ritual of public humiliation designed to mark her permanently as a fallen woman and to provide the community with an opportunity to participate in her punishment. She would be stripped of the clothing that marked her status as a respectable married woman and forced to wear the toga of a prostitute. She would be paraded through the streets of Rome while citizens expressed their moral outrage through verbal abuse and physical assault. And she would be subjected to a ceremony of degradation that would strip away not just her legal status, but her very identity as a Roman citizen. The morning of Claudia's public humiliation dawned clear and hot, with crowds already gathering in the Forum Romanum hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. Word had spread throughout the city that the adulterous wife of Marcus Valerius Messala would be displayed for public judgment, and thousands of Romans had come to witness this spectacle of justice. The crowd included people from every level of society, from wealthy patricians who had come to demonstrate their support for traditional values, to poor plebeians who welcomed any free entertainment that broke the monotony of their daily struggle for survival. Claudia was brought from her cell in the early morning, her hands bound behind her back, her hair already shorn in the traditional sign of shame. The cutting had been done roughly the night before by female slaves who showed no gentleness or sympathy, using dull shears that pulled and tore rather than cutting cleanly. Her scalp was nicked in several places where the blades had scraped too close, and dried blood darkened the stubble that remained of what had once been elaborately styled hair that marked her status as a woman of the upper classes. The ritual of clothing removal took place in a chamber beneath the forum, while crowds gathered above, waiting for the spectacle to begin. Claudia was surrounded by female attendants, whose job was to strip away every marker of her former status and identity. They removed the stola, the long dress that marked her as a respectable married woman, handling the fine fabric with deliberate roughness that tore and stained it. They took away her jewelry, the gold and precious stones that had indicated her wealth and position, treating these valuable items as if they were worthless trinkets. They removed her shoes, the well-crafted leather sandals that had protected her feet, and marked her as someone who did not need to walk on rough ground. When the clothing removal was complete, Claudia stood naked and shivering despite the warm morning air, her body exposed to the gaze of the attendants who examined her with clinical detachment. They were looking for any marks or signs that might provide additional evidence of her supposed adultery, any physical indication that could be presented to the crowd as proof of her corruption. Finding nothing, they proceeded to dress her in the garments that would mark her new status in Roman society. The toga they forced over her head was coarse wool dyed a harsh yellow color that immediately identified the wearer as a prostitute. The fabric scratched against her skin, deliberately uncomfortable, designed to be a constant reminder of her fallen state. Unlike the elegant stola she had worn as a respectable married woman, the toga was shapeless and unflattering, hanging awkwardly on her frame and making even simple movement difficult and ungainly. Over the toga, they placed a wreath of wilted flowers and rotting vegetation, a mockery of the laurel crowns awarded to heroes and poets. The decaying plant matter gave off a sickening smell that would follow Claudia throughout her ordeal, ensuring that her disgrace would assault every sense of those who encountered her. Around her neck, they hung a wooden placard inscribed with her crimes, the letters painted in red to resemble blood, announcing to anyone who could read that this woman had betrayed her husband and corrupted the sacred bonds of marriage. The parade route had been carefully planned to maximize both Claudia's humiliation and the community's participation in her punishment. Starting from the Forum, the procession would wind through every major street and square in Rome, passing the homes of her former friends, the shops where she had once been welcomed as a valued customer, the temples where she had worshipped as a respectable citizen. The route was designed to take several hours, ensuring that word would spread ahead of the procession and that crowds would have time to gather at every stop. As Claudia emerged from the chamber beneath the Forum, the roar of the crowd was deafening. Thousands of voices merged into a single sound of condemnation, a wall of noise that seemed to physically assault her as she stumbled into the blazing sunlight. The sound was not just disapproval, but active hatred, the collective voice of a community expressing its moral outrage and its determination to see justice done. The crowd had been organized to ensure maximum participation in Claudia's punishment. Groups of women from various neighborhoods had positioned themselves along the route, each group competing to demonstrate their virtue by expressing the most dramatic outrage at Claudia's crimes. They hurled verbal abuse with practiced efficiency, their voices rising above the general noise to ensure their individual contributions to the punishment were noticed and appreciated. Children had been specifically encouraged to participate, their parents lifting them onto shoulders so they could see better and handing them rotten vegetables and small stones to throw. The participation of children was considered essential because it demonstrated that the community's values were being passed to the next generation, that the punishment of adulteresses was not just about individual justice, but about maintaining social order across time. The first missiles began flying before Claudia had taken 10 steps into the Forum. Rotten eggs exploded against her chest and face, covering her with sulfurous slime that made breathing difficult and nauseating. Spoiled fruit followed, tomatoes and figs that had been saved specifically for this purpose, their putrid contents splattering across her yellow toga and running down her legs. The smell was overwhelming, a combination of decay and fermentation that made several people in the crowd cover their noses, despite their enthusiasm for the spectacle. But the vegetables were only the beginning. As the procession moved through the streets, the nature of the projectiles escalated. Handfuls of mud mixed with human and animal waste were scooped from the gutters and hurled with careful aim. Small stones, not large enough to cause serious injury, but substantial enough to hurt when they struck, pelted Claudia from every direction. Broken pottery shards, sharp enough to cut but too small to be immediately dangerous, sliced through the coarse fabric of her toga and left thin lines of blood across her arms and legs. The verbal assault was as relentless as the physical one. Every person in the crowd seemed determined to contribute their own creative insult, their own expression of moral superiority. They called her whore and betrayer and corruption of womanhood. They shouted that she had dishonored not just her husband, but every decent woman in Rome. They declared that her punishment was too mild, that she deserved death, that exile was insufficient for someone who had violated the sacred trust of marriage. Roman citizens who had known Claudia personally took special pleasure in denouncing her publicly. Former friends competed to demonstrate their virtue by expressing the most dramatic shock at her behavior, claiming they had always suspected something was wrong, that they had tried to warn her husband, that they were relieved her true nature had finally been revealed. Shopkeepers, who had once welcomed her business, now proclaimed that they had always found her suspicious, that they had noticed signs of moral corruption that they should have reported earlier. The procession paused at significant locations throughout the city to allow for special ceremonies of denunciation. At the Temple of Vesta, the sacred shrine dedicated to the goddess of hearth and home, Claudia was forced to prostrate herself before the altar, while the priestesses proclaimed that she had violated everything the goddess represented. The Vestal virgins, women who had dedicated their lives to chastity and religious service, took turns condemning Claudia's behavior and calling upon the gods to witness her punishment. At the Forum Boarium, the great market where Claudia had once shopped as a respectable citizen, merchants who had profited from her custom now refused to acknowledge any previous relationship with her. They proclaimed loudly that they had never approved of her behavior, that they had always served her reluctantly, that they were grateful she would no longer contaminate their honest businesses with her presence. The most devastating stop was at the home of Gaius Asinius Pollio, where the dinner party had taken place that had led to Claudia's destruction. Pollio himself emerged from his house to address the crowd, distancing himself completely from the woman who had once been a welcome guest in his home. He declared that he had been deceived by Claudia's apparent respectability, that he now realized her behavior at his dinner party had been inappropriate and dangerous, that he regretted providing the opportunity for her misconduct. As the procession continued through the afternoon, Claudia's physical condition deteriorated rapidly. The combination of the blazing sun, the constant bombardment of projectiles, and the emotional trauma of her public humiliation began to take their toll. Her skin, exposed to the harsh Roman sun and covered with rotting organic matter, began to burn and blister. The cuts from pottery shards became infected with bacteria from the filth that covered her. Her feet, unprotected by shoes, were cut and bruised from walking over rough stones and broken debris. More devastating than the physical damage was the psychological impact of being reduced from a respected citizen to a public object of hatred and contempt. Claudia had lived her entire life within the structures of Roman society, deriving her identity and sense of worth from her position as a senator's wife, her education, her connections to other prominent families. Now all of that had been stripped away, replaced by a new identity as a social pariah whose very existence served as a warning to other women. The crowd's enthusiasm for Claudia's punishment never wavered throughout the long afternoon. If anything, it seemed to grow stronger as the procession continued. Fed by the collective participation in moral judgment and the satisfaction of seeing traditional values upheld through decisive action. People who had joined the crowd out of curiosity found themselves caught up in the emotional intensity of the moment, adding their own voices to the condemnation, throwing their own projectiles, competing with others to demonstrate their commitment to justice. By the time the procession returned to the Forum in the early evening, Claudia was barely recognizable as the woman who had emerged that morning. She was covered head to foot in filth and blood, her toga torn and stained beyond recognition, her body marked with cuts and bruises from the stones and debris that had struck her. She could barely walk, stumbling forward only because guards on either side prevented her from falling. Her face was swollen from the impact of projectiles and from exposure to the sun. her eyes nearly closed, her lips cracked and bleeding. The final ceremony took place on the steps of the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the most sacred site in Rome, where Claudia would be formally stripped of her Roman citizenship before being sent into exile. The high priest emerged in his ceremonial robes to pronounce the ritual words that would complete her transformation from citizen to non-person, from Roman matron to social outcast. The priest's voice carried across the hushed forum as he recited the ancient formula that removed Claudia from the protection of Roman law and Roman society. He declared that she had forfeited her right to be called Roman through her betrayal of Roman values, that she had chosen corruption over virtue, that she would carry the mark of her shame wherever she went for the remainder of her days. The crowd responded with ritual phrases of agreement, their collective voice sealing Claudia's fate. As the sun set over the 7 hills of Rome, Claudia was loaded onto a ship that would carry her to the island of Pandateria, a barren rock in the Tyrrhenian Sea, where Rome sent its most notorious female criminals. The island was essentially a prison without walls, surrounded by treacherous waters that made escape impossible, populated only by other exiled women and the minimal staff required to keep them alive. The journey to Pandateria took 3 days, during which Claudia was kept chained in the ship's hold like cargo rather than a human passenger. She was given minimal food and water, just enough to ensure she would survive to reach her destination. The sailors treated her with contempt and cruelty, seeing her not as a person deserving of basic humanity, but as a convicted criminal whose suffering was both justified and entertaining. When Claudia finally arrived at Pandateria, she discovered that exile was not simply banishment, but a carefully designed system of perpetual punishment. The island was barely 3 miles long and less than 2 miles wide, a windswept outcropping of volcanic rock with no natural harbour, no fertile soil, no fresh water springs. The few buildings that existed were crude stone structures designed for survival rather than comfort, housing perhaps 50 other women who had been sent there for various crimes against Roman morality. The women of Pandateria existed in a state of permanent degradation that made their previous lives seem like distant dreams. They were forbidden from wearing any clothing that might suggest former status or dignity. Everyone dressed in the same rough brown tunics made from the coarsest wool, garments that provided minimal protection from the elements and constant irritation to skin that had once been pampered with oils and perfumes. Their heads remained shaved, not as a one-time punishment, but as a permanent condition. Their scalps scraped raw every few months by guards who took pleasure in the task. Food on the island consisted of whatever could be grown in the thin soil or caught from the dangerous waters surrounding the rocks. The women survived on a diet of coarse bread, thin gruel, occasional fish when the weather permitted fishing, and whatever vegetables could be coaxed from small garden plots that yielded poor harvests in the harsh climate. Many women developed scurvy from lack of proper nutrition, their teeth loosening and falling out, their skin developing dark patches and open sores that never fully healed. The psychological torment of exile was perhaps more devastating than the physical hardships. These women had been torn from everything familiar, everyone they had ever loved, every source of identity and meaning they had ever known. They were forbidden from communicating with family or friends on the mainland. No letters could be sent or received. No visitors were permitted. They existed in a state of social death, cut off completely from the world they had once inhabited. But Claudia's story was not unique, and to understand the full horror of Roman punishment for adulteresses, you need to hear about Claudia Messalina, whose fate reveals how even the most powerful women in the empire were vulnerable to accusations that could destroy them instantly. Messalina was the 3rd wife of Emperor Claudius, one of the most powerful women in the Roman world, with access to unlimited wealth, influence over imperial policy, and the protection that came from being married to the ruler of the known world. Yet even Messalina's exalted position could not protect her when accusations of adultery arose. In the year 48 AD, while Emperor Claudius was away from Rome on official business, Messalina was accused of having gone through a marriage ceremony with a young senator named Gaius Silius. Whether this ceremony was a legitimate wedding, a symbolic ritual, or simply an elaborate dinner party that was misinterpreted by enemies remains unclear from the historical sources. What is clear is that the accusation was enough to trigger the full machinery of Roman justice against the empress herself. The speed with which Messalina's destruction unfolded reveals how precarious even the highest-ranking women's positions truly were in Roman society. Within hours of the accusation being made, imperial guards surrounded her villa, preventing her from fleeing or communicating with potential allies. Her servants and attendants were arrested and tortured to extract confessions about their mistress's alleged misconduct. Her children were taken from her and placed under guard to prevent them from being used as leverage in any attempt to save their mother. The interrogation of Messalina's household staff revealed the methods Roman authorities used to build cases against accused women. Slaves were subjected to increasingly severe torture until they provided the testimony their interrogators wanted to hear. Under Roman law, slave testimony was only considered reliable if it had been extracted through physical coercion, based on the assumption that slaves would lie to protect their masters unless pain compelled them to tell the truth. The slaves described elaborate dinner parties where Messalina had entertained male guests, conversations where she had discussed political matters with senators, occasions where she had laughed or smiled in ways that could be interpreted as flirtatious. These normal activities of a powerful woman managing her social and political relationships were transformed through torture-induced testimony into evidence of systematic adultery and betrayal of her imperial husband. Messalina was not granted a trial in the traditional sense. As empress, she occupied a unique position that placed her above normal legal procedures, while simultaneously making her more vulnerable to summary judgment. Emperor Claudius, faced with reports of his wife's alleged misconduct and under pressure from advisors who may have had their own reasons for wanting Messalina removed, made the decision to have her executed immediately without formal proceedings. The execution took place in private, away from public view, not out of mercy but to avoid the political complications that might arise from the public spectacle of an empress being killed for adultery. Messalina was stabbed to death in her own garden by imperial guards while she was attempting to compose a letter to her husband defending her innocence. Her body was left unburied for several days, denied the funeral rites that were considered essential for a peaceful afterlife, before finally being disposed of in an unmarked grave. The destruction of Messalina sent shockwaves through Roman society because it demonstrated that no woman, regardless of her position or power, was immune from accusations of adultery and the devastating punishments that followed. If an empress could be destroyed overnight, based on rumors and forced confessions, what hope did ordinary women have of protecting themselves from similar fates? These stories reveal the terrifying machinery of a civilization that used accusations of adultery as weapons of mass destruction against women. From Livia Marcella trembling in the Forum Romanum to Claudia Pulkra dying in exile on a barren island. From Valeria Messalina murdered in her own garden to countless unnamed women destroyed by whispers and rumors, we see how quickly supposed justice becomes systematic terror. Roman law didn't just punish adulteresses. It created an entire apparatus designed to transform any woman into a target, any conversation into evidence, any display of intelligence or personality into proof of corruption. Remember these women. Remember how easily civilization becomes barbarism when power goes unchecked.